There is a moment, maybe it already happened to you, maybe it's still coming, when you walk into a room and no one turns to look. Not because you did anything wrong. Not because anyone is being cruel. It's simply that the world has quietly, without ceremony, stopped watching you the way it used to. The phone rings less. The invitations thin out. Your name comes up in fewer conversations than it once did. And here is the strange, almost embarrassing truth nobody prepares you for. Underneath the sting of that moment, if you sit with it long enough, something else is waiting. Not grief. Not entirely grief, anyway. Something closer to relief. A loosening in your chest you didn't know you'd been holding. Because being forgotten by the world, it turns out, is not only a loss. It might be the doorway to the most honest peace you will ever feel. In the next 50 minutes, I want to walk with you through something most people are too afraid to say out loud. That fading from the world's attention after 70 is not only a tragedy waiting to happen to you. It's a transformation, and it has a shape and a logic and even a kind of grace to it if you know where to look. We're going to go through 8 specific ways the world's forgetting can quietly hand you back your life. Not by pretending the losses aren't real, but by showing you what's underneath them. By the end, I hope you'll hear your own life a little differently. Not as something shrinking, but as something finally settling into its true size. You don't need to have already felt this piece to keep listening. Maybe right now the loneliness is louder than anything else. And that's all right. We're going to take this slowly, one honest piece at a time, so that by the time we reach the end, what once felt like disappearing might start to feel like something you can actually rest inside. Reason number 1. Let's start with the one most people feel first, even before they can put words to it. Think about the last time you got ready to leave the house. Did you check the mirror twice? Smooth your collar? Wonder, even for a second, what people might think of you. For most of your life, that instinct was automatic. You didn't even notice you were doing it. For decades, you were, in some sense, always on a stage. Not a literal one, but every room you walked into came with an audience, and every audience came with a judgment, spoken or not. As a young parent, you were being watched to see if you were doing it right, whether your children behaved, whether your house looked put together, whether you seemed to have your life in order the way a good parent should. At work, you were watched to see if you were competent, ambitious, likable enough to promote, careful enough not to be let go. In your neighborhood, your choices, your car, your yard, your children's manners, all of it was material for someone else's opinion of you. This wasn't paranoia. It was simply how the social world works when you are visible in it. Every visible person carries the weight of being interpreted by others, and that weight is heavier than most people admit, because it never fully turns off. Even alone, you carry an internal audience, rehearsing what you'll say, editing yourself before you've even spoken, imagining how a conversation might be received before you've even started it. Here is what almost nobody tells you about growing older. That audience thins out, not because you've failed, because attention as a resource moves toward whoever is newest, whoever is loudest, whoever is most useful to the machinery of ambition and commerce. And when you're no longer chasing a promotion, no longer trying to impress a room, no longer being measured against a standard someone else invented, the audience simply wanders off to watch someone else's performance. First, this feels like erasure. It can feel like you've been quietly demoted from the main character of your own life to an extra in someone else's. But stay with that feeling a moment longer, and something shifts. If no one is watching, no one is judging. If no one is judging, there is nothing left to perform. And if there is nothing left to perform, then for the first time in longer than you can remember, the face you show the world and the face you actually are can finally be the same face. You can wear the sweater you actually like instead of the one that photographs well. You can say the honest thing instead of the impressive thing. You can rest on a Tuesday afternoon without composing an explanation for why you deserve to. If your younger self could see you now, unhurried, unwatched, no longer editing every gesture for an invisible panel of judges, she might mistake it for defeat. She spent so many years believing that being watched closely was the same thing as matching. It will take you this much life to learn that the two were never actually the same thing at all, and that matching, real matching, never needed an audience to make it true. Consider something as small as a family gathering. There was a version of you, maybe 20 years ago, who walked into that room already calculating. Did the meal look impressive enough? Did the house seem clean enough? Were the grandchildren dressed well enough to reflect properly on you? Would a particular relative approve of the choices you'd made that year? None of that calculation was vanity, exactly. It was simply the tax you paid for being visible in a family system that, like every social system, kept score without ever announcing the rules out loud. Now picture that same gathering today. Some of that calculating quiet has gone. You show up as you are, tired or not, dressed up or not, and the room mostly just lets you be there. That shift didn't happen because you stopped caring about the people in that room. It happened because the performance you once felt obligated to give them has finally been allowed to end. That's not decline. That's release. Think of it this way. For years you were writing a script for an audience that kept changing its mind about what it wanted from you. Now the audience has left the theater, and you're the only one left in the building. That silence you feel isn't punishment. It's the stage going dark so you can finally stop acting and just be. And an empty theater, it turns out, is a strange kind of privacy you spent a lifetime never quite getting to enjoy. Reason number 2. And this one follows naturally from the first, because once the performance ends, something else quietly falls away with it. Somewhere in the middle of your life, maybe without ever choosing it, you became the person other people needed. The one who remembered the birthdays. The one who fixed things, drove people places, mediated arguments, held the family together when it threatened to come apart. Being needed felt, for a long time, indistinguishable from being loved. Can you remember a season of your life when your value to others and your value to yourself were basically the same equation, when a full calendar felt like proof that you mattered? Here is the harder truth underneath that. Being needed and being loved are not actually the same thing, even though they can feel identical for decades. Being needed is functional. It's about what you provide, what you solve, what you carry for someone else so they don't have to carry it themselves. And functional value, by its nature, has an expiration date because eventually people learn to carry things themselves, or they no longer need what you once provided, or they simply move through a different season of their own life, one where your particular help no longer fits the shape of their days. When the world stops needing you in the way it once did, it can feel like the ground has vanished from under a huge part of your identity. Many people spend their 60s and 70s quietly mourning not the loss of ability, but the loss of being indispensable, the loss of the phone ringing with someone who needed exactly what only you could give them. But look closer at what's actually happening. When the demands fall away, when nobody is calling you at midnight with a crisis only you can solve, what remains is not nothing. What remains is you, without the armor of usefulness. And that is terrifying for exactly as long as it takes to realize that the people who still show up, who still call, who still want to sit with you even though they no longer need anything from you, they are not there for your usefulness anymore. They are there for you. That is a different, deeper, far more durable kind of love than the one built on being needed. It doesn't require you to perform a function. It doesn't ask you to keep proving your worth with each visit. It only requires you to exist, sitting across the table, telling the same old story you've told 100 times, and being welcome to tell it again. Watch your grandchildren, if you have them, the next time they climb into your lap or ask to hear a story they've already heard a dozen times. They don't want anything solved. They aren't there because you can fix a problem for them. They're there simply because sitting near you feels good, in a way that has nothing to do with your usefulness and everything to do with who you are when nothing is being asked of you. That is the exact shape of the love that survives, once the more transactional versions of it have quietly fallen away. Think about the difference between two kinds of visits you may have had over the years. There's the visit where someone arrives because they need something from you, a favor, advice, help with a project, and the conversation, however warm, is shaped around that need. And there's the other kind, rarer and easy to overlook at the time, where someone shows up simply to sit in your kitchen, drink coffee, and talk about nothing in particular before leaving again. For most of your life, the first kind of visit probably outnumbered the second, simply because you were so relentlessly useful that people had less occasion to visit you for no reason at all. Now, with fewer demands on you, the visits that remain are disproportionately the second kind. That's not because people need you less. It's because the visits that are left are the ones that were never about need in the first place. That's not abandonment. That's the difference finally becoming visible. Notice how much quieter your days have become, and ask yourself honestly, Is that quiet actually empty? Or is it simply undisturbed for the first time in 50 years? The love that remains once usefulness fades is the only love you can ever fully trust, because it was never asking anything of you to begin with. It was there before you were useful, and it turns out it was patiently waiting there the whole time, underneath all that being needed. Reason number 3. Now let's talk about something almost no one says out loud, because it sounds, on the surface, a little unkind. But stay with me, because underneath it is something quietly wonderful. When was the last time you compared your life to someone else's? Their house, their children's careers, their retirement savings, how well they seem to be aging compared to you. Be honest. For most of your adult life, that comparison was running somewhere in the background, whether you invited it or not. Comparison is one of the oldest and most exhausting habits of the human mind, and it thrives on visibility. As long as you are clearly seen, clearly ranked, clearly part of a social hierarchy of achievement, status, or appearance, your mind will keep score, often without your permission. This is not a character flaw. It's simply how social animals are built, wired across a lifetime to check where they stand relative to the people around them. For decades, you were being measured, at work against colleagues, at school functions against other parents, at reunions against old classmates whose lives seemed to be unfolding on a different, shinier timeline. And whether you admitted it or not, some part of you was always quietly calculating where you stood, whether you were ahead or behind, keeping pace or falling short. Here is what changes when the world's attention moves elsewhere. The scoreboard doesn't just show fewer points for you. It starts to disappear altogether for everyone, because the game itself was always dependent on an audience keeping track. Once you are no longer competing for the same job, the same social status, the same visible markers of success as people decades younger, the entire comparison machine loses its fuel. You stop being ranked not because you lost, but because the tournament ended and everyone quietly went home. And in that emptied arena, something remarkable becomes possible. Measuring your life only against your own life. Not against your neighbor's retirement account. Not against your old classmates' grandchildren, their careers, their vacations. Only against the years you've actually lived, and whether they were, in your own honest accounting, worth living. That's a far kinder measuring stick than the one you spent decades holding yourself to. Think about a class reunion you may have attended once, years ago, and the peculiar exhaustion that came with it. Walking in, you probably clocked, almost instantly and almost against your will, who looked older, who looked wealthier, whose children seemed to be thriving more visibly than yours. That instinct wasn't cruelty. It was simply the comparison machine doing what it was built to do, running its quiet tally in the background of an otherwise pleasant evening. Now imagine attending that same kind of gathering today, among people your own age, all of you further along the same road, none of you quite as interested anymore in who has more of what. The tallying has mostly gone quiet, not because anyone lost the game, but because most of you have finally recognized it was never a game worth playing to begin with. That's not being left behind. That's being released from a race you never agreed to run in the first place. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes when you finally stop checking the scoreboard. Try noticing it the next time you catch yourself out of old habit, comparing your life to someone else's. Ask yourself gently, compared to what exactly and for whose benefit? Most days you'll find the question doesn't even apply anymore. And that is not a small thing to lose. It's one of the heaviest things you'll ever put down. And once it's down, you'll wonder how you carried it so long without noticing the weight. Some days you might catch a flicker of the old habit anyway. A glance at a neighbor's new car. A passing thought about a sibling's more comfortable retirement. That flicker isn't a failure. It's just an old muscle remembering how it used to move. What's different now is how quickly it lets go, how little power it has to actually settle into you and stay, the way it once could for days at a time. The habit is fading. You don't have to force it out. You only have to notice, gently each time, that the race it's referencing no longer exists. Reason number 4. This next one is subtle, and it might be the one that stings the most at first because it touches something people have used to answer a very old question about themselves. Think about the first thing strangers used to ask you at a party. It was almost always some version of, "So, what do you do? Your job, your role, your title." For most of adult life, that single sentence was expected to summarize you, to hand a stranger a shortcut into understanding who you were. For decades, identity and occupation were fused together so tightly that most people couldn't easily separate them even if they tried. You weren't just a teacher, a nurse, an engineer, a business owner, a parent managing a household. In the eyes of the world, you were that role. It organized your calendar, your self-respect, your sense of contribution, even the way you introduced yourself to strangers at weddings and holiday gatherings. Retirement, for many people, isn't simply the end of a paycheck. It's the quiet unraveling of the story other people used to tell about who you were, the sudden absence of the one sentence that used to answer everything. Some people try to fill that absence quickly, taking on a new title almost immediately: volunteer coordinator, board member, something official sounding to hand out at the next introduction. There's nothing wrong with that instinct, but it's worth asking honestly whether you're reaching for a new title because it genuinely interests you, or because the silence where the old one used to sit still feels too unfamiliar to simply let be. Both reasons are understandable. Only one of them actually needs answering with a new role. And when the world stops asking what you do because you no longer do the thing that used to define you, it can feel, at first, like being erased from the record. Nobody hands you a new title to replace the old one. There is no ceremony where the world announces, "This is who you are now." You're simply left standing there, without the shorthand you used to lean on at every introduction. This is disorienting, and it is allowed to be difficult. But underneath the discomfort is an invitation almost no one gets earlier in life. The chance to discover who you are when you are not defined by what you produce. Not the job title, not the role, just the actual texture of your mind, your humor, your curiosity, the particular way you notice the world, the small opinions you've never had time to voice, all of which existed long before your career did, and all of which will outlast it. The world stopped asking what you do. It never once asked who you are. That question was always yours to answer, and now, finally, you have the room to answer it honestly without a job title getting in the way first. Think about the business cards, the name tags, the introductions at church or at the pharmacy counter that used to come attached to a title. This is Robert. He was an engineer for 30 years. This is Linda. She used to run the school district's finance office. People meant well when they introduced you that way. It gave strangers something to hold on to. But notice what's missing from every one of those introductions. Nothing about what makes you laugh. Nothing about the questions you still lie awake wondering about. Nothing about the particular way you've come to see the world after all these years. The title was always a placeholder, a convenient substitute standing in for the much longer, much more interesting answer nobody had time to hear at a dinner party. Now that the placeholder has quietly retired along with you, the fuller answer finally has room to exist. That's not disappearance. That's finally being asked the right question by yourself at last. If a stranger asked you today who you are, with no mention of your old job allowed in the answer, what would you actually say? Sit with that question for a moment, because the answer you find there is closer to the truth of you than any title ever was, and it was there all along, quietly waiting underneath the job. Maybe the honest answer involves the way you notice birds now, something you never had time for during your working years. Maybe it involves the patience you've grown, or a particular sense of humor that only fully emerged once you stopped needing to seem serious for a boardroom. None of that would have fit on a business card. All of it was always more truly you than the title ever managed to capture. Let me pause here for a second, because I want to make sure something has actually landed with you, not just passed by. Everything we've talked about so far, the performance ending, the usefulness fading, the comparisons dropping away, the old titles losing their grip, all of it points toward the same quiet discovery. The world isn't punishing you by forgetting you. It's simply stepping back, and in stepping back, it's leaving room for something it was always, without meaning to, crowding out. If you've felt even a flicker of recognition in anything so far, some quiet part of you nodding along, hold on to that feeling. Because what comes next goes even deeper, into places most people never let themselves look. Stay with me for the second half of this, because it's easy to hear the first 4 reasons and think you already understand where this is going. You don't, not yet. The next 4 move away from what the world takes from you, and toward something much closer to what it quietly gives back, in ways almost nobody names out loud. Reason number 5, and this is where things get a little more personal because it's about a very specific kind of invisibility, and what's hiding just behind it. Have you noticed it yet, in the grocery store, at a restaurant, on a busy sidewalk, the way people's eyes seem to move past you now, almost as if you're made of glass? Younger people, especially, seem to look straight through you, not out of unkindness, but because their attention is simply pulled elsewhere, toward their phones, their friends, their own hurried lives. This particular kind of invisibility is one of the most disorienting parts of growing older, because for most of your life, being seen was not optional. As a child, you needed to be seen to be cared for. As a young adult, you needed to be seen to be chosen, for a job, a partner, a friendship. Even into midlife, visibility was currency, socially, professionally, romantically, the thing that opened doors and got you noticed in a crowded room. So when that visibility begins to fade in public spaces, when clerks address the younger person beside you first, when your comments in a group seem to land with less weight than they once did, it can feel like a kind of social death happening in slow motion, while you're still very much alive to witness it happening to you. But here is what almost nobody explains about this experience. The eyes of strangers were never actually seeing you in the first place. They were seeing a category, a role, an age bracket, a job title, an assumption about your usefulness or relevance to whatever transaction was happening. What's disappearing now isn't you. It's the shorthand version of you that strangers used to substitute for actually knowing you. And once that shorthand fades, once the world stops offering you its quick, shallow read, you're left with an unexpected gift. The chance to become visible to yourself in a way you may never have had the stillness to attempt before. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you sat quietly and simply noticed your own mind, without performing for anyone, without being interrupted by anyone's expectation of you, without a schedule pulling you toward the next thing? Public invisibility, as painful as it can feel in the moment at the checkout counter, often forces open a private visibility that most busy, watched lives never make room for. Think about the last time you sat somewhere in public, a bench, a waiting room, a coffee shop, and simply watched the world move around you without anyone acknowledging you at all. There was a time when that same scene would have felt like a small humiliation, proof that you no longer registered. But sit there long enough and something else can surface instead. The chance to actually notice things. The particular slant of afternoon light on the sidewalk. The way a stranger's laugh carries across a room. The specific, unhurried pleasure of having nowhere you're expected to be and no one expecting a version of you to perform. That noticing, that slow, unbothered attention to the world, is something almost impossible to access when you're busy being seen. It only opens up once being seen stops being the point. There's a particular kind of person who sits on a park bench in the middle of a weekday afternoon, watching, unhurried, clearly at peace with being unremarkable to everyone passing by. For most of your life, you may have quietly pitied that person, mistaking their stillness for loneliness. It's worth reconsidering that judgment now that you may be closer to becoming that very person yourself. What once looked like being overlooked may actually have been someone who had simply finished needing to be looked at. That's not disappearing. That's finally turning the light inward, toward the one person who was always there and rarely fully looked at. Here's a question worth sitting with for the rest of today. If no one in public sees you any more the way they once did, who has been quietly waiting this whole time for you to finally look at them instead? There is a particular kind of company you can only keep with yourself, and it requires exactly this kind of quiet. The world stopped looking at you in the produce aisle. It did not stop you from finally, deeply, looking at yourself. Reason number 6. This next one touches something almost everyone carries but rarely says plainly, because it sounds, at first, like giving up. Somewhere along the way, did you start keeping a private ledger, an unspoken list of accomplishments, promotions, milestones, things you were supposed to have achieved by a certain age? Most people do, whether they admit it or not, and most people carry it much longer than they realize. For most of adult life, achievement operates like a second heartbeat, quiet, constant, mostly unnoticed until it stops. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that a well-lived life could be measured. The career you built, the house you owned, the children you raised well, the retirement you secured, the milestones checked off in roughly the right order at roughly the right time. Every one of these became a kind of scorecard, and the scorekeeping never fully rested because there was always a next milestone waiting just past the current one, always a reason to feel you hadn't quite arrived yet. Even rest itself sometimes felt like it needed to be earned first, permission granted only after enough had been accomplished. Here is the quiet shift that happens when the world stops keeping score on you. Not because your life stopped mattering, but because the scorekeepers, employers, institutions, the wider culture obsessed with productivity and youth, simply move their attention to people still in the middle of the race, still climbing toward whatever comes next. And when no one outside you is tallying your accomplishments anymore, you're left holding a strange kind of freedom. The freedom to stop counting too. To let a day simply be a day, not a unit of output. To let a walk be a walk, not exercise logged toward a goal. To let a conversation be a conversation, not networking, not building anything, just two people talking because they enjoy each other's company, with nothing to show for it afterward except the pleasure of having talked. This is not resignation. This is what philosophers and psychologists have circled for centuries without quite landing on the plain, ordinary truth of it. A life doesn't need to keep producing evidence of its worth in order to be worth living. Think about a garden if you keep one, or a hobby you've picked back up, woodworking, painting, puzzles, whatever it happens to be. Notice how differently it feels to tend something with no deadline, no client, no performance review waiting at the end of it. A tomato plant doesn't care whether you finish it by Friday. A half-finished painting doesn't get docked points for taking 3 months instead of 3 weeks. For most of your working life, nearly everything you touched came with an implied clock and an implied judge. The quiet, almost radical discovery of later life is that most things worth doing were never actually improved by that clock or that judge in the first place. They were simply endured despite them. Even rest looks different now. There was a version of vacation years ago that had to be documented, photographed, reported back on, almost as if leisure itself needed evidence to count as legitimate. An afternoon nap now needs no justification to anyone, least of all to you. It is simply an afternoon, spent exactly as it wanted to be spent, with no committee anywhere reviewing the decision. That's not falling behind. That's finally being allowed to simply live, instead of constantly proving that you deserve to. Before we go further, I want you to try something. Think of one thing you did today that produced absolutely nothing, no result, no achievement, nothing you could report to anyone, and notice whether some old habit in you wants to apologize for it. That habit is worth examining closely, because it may be the last remnant of a scorecard nobody is reading anymore. As the psychiatrist Carl Jung once put it, thoroughly unprepared, we take the step into the afternoon of life. Almost no one is taught how to live once the morning's urgency is over, how to move through hours that don't need to justify themselves with output. But that afternoon light, once you stop squinting at it through the lens of achievement, turns out to be some of the gentlest, most honest light you will ever stand in. Let that settle for a moment. The scorecard is gone. Nobody is grading this part. What's left, underneath decades of counting, is simply your life, uncounted, unranked, and entirely your own to feel, rather than measure. Reason number 7. Now we come to something a little more uncomfortable to name, because it touches how other people used to use you, sometimes without either of you fully realizing it. Have you ever noticed how younger relatives sometimes talk about you as an example, either as a warning or as an inspiration, rather than simply as a person? I don't want to end up like that. Or, on the kinder end, I hope I'm still like her at that age. Both are compliments and both are cages, whether or not the person saying them ever means any harm by it. For much of later life, without ever asking for the role, you can become a symbol in other people's stories rather than a character in your own. Younger family members, co-workers, even strangers, sometimes reduce an older person to a lesson. Proof that hard work pays off, or proof that life is short, or a cautionary tale about what happens if you don't take care of yourself, or don't save enough, or don't stay close to family. This symbolic role, even when it's flattering, quietly strips away complexity. Nobody wants to hear that the inspiring elder also feels lonely on Tuesday afternoons, or that the cautionary tale also had years of real joy that don't fit the narrative being told about them at holiday tables. Being used as a symbol, even a positive one, is its own kind of loneliness, because it asks you to hold still inside someone else's meaning instead of being fully, messily yourself with all your contradictions intact. Here is what changes when the world's attention moves on, and you are no longer prominently cast in anyone's cautionary tale or inspirational speech. The symbolic weight lifts. You stop being Exhibit A for someone else's life lesson, and you get to go back to being simply, complicatedly human. Contradictory. capable of both regret and contentment in the same afternoon, without anyone needing you to pick one and stay in it for their story to make sense. Nobody needs you to represent anything anymore. You don't have to be a warning. You don't have to be a triumph. You just get to be a person living an ordinary day, which, it turns out, was always the deepest thing you had to offer anyone in the first place, long before anyone tried to turn you into a lesson. Think about how often, at a family dinner, someone has turned to you and said something like, "Tell them what you always say about hard work," or, "You're the one who always figures things out. Tell her what to do." In that moment, you're not being asked a question. You're being handed a script, cast in a part you may not have chosen, expected to deliver the line that fits the story the family already tells about you. Saying something true but unexpected in that moment, admitting uncertainty, admitting you don't actually have the answer this time, can feel like breaking character. The quiet freedom of being forgotten by the wider spotlight is that fewer people are waiting for you to deliver that line anymore. You can simply say what's true, uncertainty and all, without disappointing anyone's idea of who you're supposed to be. It's a strange kind of relief admitting to a grandchild that you don't actually know what you're doing half the time, that you made most of it up as you went along just like everyone does. Somewhere along the way, they stopped needing you to be certain. What they actually wanted all along was for you to be honest. That was always a far easier thing to give than the wisdom everyone assumed you were supposed to have on demand. That's not becoming irrelevant. That's finally being released from having to mean something to everyone else so you can simply be something to yourself. Ask yourself quietly whether there's a role you've been playing for someone else's benefit, warning, inspiration, proof of something that you never actually agreed to. Somewhere, a younger relative may still be deciding what kind of symbol to make of you. You no longer have to audition for either role. Let them write their own meanings. Your life was never a lesson to begin with. It was simply a life, and that was always enough, even on the days nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. Reason number 8, and this is the one I think ties everything else together, because it isn't really about being forgotten by other people at all. It's about what happens in the silence that forgetting leaves behind. Think of an evening at home, no phone ringing, no one expecting anything from you, the house quiet in a way it rarely was 20 years ago. What is that silence actually made of? For most of your life, silence was rare, and when it did arrive, it often felt like waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for someone to need you, waiting for the next demand on your attention to land. Silence used to be the pause between obligations, never the point itself, never something you were allowed to simply rest inside without wondering what you were supposed to be doing instead. Many people spend decades so wrapped in noise, responsibilities, relationships, the low hum of being watched and needed and measured, that they never learn what silence actually feels like when it isn't simply the absence of something else, waiting to be filled again. But the particular quiet that comes later in life, the quiet the world leaves behind once it stops watching, needing, comparing, defining, scoring, and symbolizing you, is a different kind of silence altogether. It isn't empty. It's furnished with decades of memory, with hard-won understanding, with a familiarity with yourself that took an entire lifetime to earn and could not have been rushed. Psychologically, this is one of the least discussed gifts of growing older. Solitude stops being a void to be filled and starts becoming a room you actually enjoy sitting in, one you built unknowingly out of every year that came before it. The silence isn't asking anything of you. It isn't judging you, comparing you, needing you, or symbolizing you. For possibly the first time since childhood, the quiet is simply company, and you are finally, fully permitted to keep it for as long as you'd like. Think about the particular sound of a clock ticking in an otherwise silent house, the kind of sound that used to feel unbearable decades ago. Back when silence meant something was wrong, or someone should be calling, or you should be doing something more productive with the hour. Notice how that same sound can, later in life, become almost comforting, steady, unhurried, asking nothing of you. Some evenings, you might find yourself sitting in a chair doing absolutely nothing, not reading, not watching anything, just sitting, and rather than reaching for your phone to fill the space, you let it stay empty. That capacity to let a quiet hour simply be quiet, without reaching to fill it, is not something you were born with. It's something the years, and everything the years took away, finally made room for. This is, in its own quiet way, the last and deepest lesson the world's forgetting has to offer. Not that you no longer matter to anyone, but that you no longer need anyone's attention to know that you matter to yourself. That knowledge was always available to you, underneath all the noise. It simply took the noise fading for you to finally hear it clearly. That's not loneliness. That's peace, arriving late, but arriving completely, and staying. Notice the next time the house goes quiet, whether it actually feels like absence or whether, if you let it, it might feel more like being home. Truly home, in your own life, without an audience, without a role to perform, without a scoreboard to check. Just you and the life you actually lived, sitting together in the same quiet room, with nowhere else either of you needs to be. None of this means the losses aren't real. It would be dishonest to pretend that fewer phone calls don't sting, that an empty calendar doesn't sometimes ache, that there aren't afternoons when the quiet feels less like peace and more like absence. Both things are true at once, and you don't have to choose only one of them to believe. The world's attention really has moved elsewhere, and that really can hurt. But underneath that hurt, patiently, without asking for credit, something else has been quietly gathering itself this whole time, waiting for you to notice it was there. Do you remember the moment I described at the very beginning, walking into a room where no one turns to look? I want you to picture that room again, now that we've spent this time together. The room hasn't changed, but maybe you have. That absence of attention, the one that once felt like erasure, might now feel like something closer to shelter. Nobody is watching, so nothing needs to be performed. Nobody needs anything from you. So what remains is love that asks for nothing. Nobody is comparing, so there's no race left to lose. Nobody is asking what you do, so you finally get to answer who you are. Nobody's eyes catch you in the crowd, so you finally get to catch your own reflection, honestly, for once. Nobody is keeping score, so the day is simply allowed to be a day. Nobody needs you to be a lesson, so you're free to just be a life. And in the quiet all of that leaves behind, you get to discover that being forgotten by the world was never really the ending it seemed to be. It was the world, in its own clumsy way, finally stepping aside so you could meet yourself. Maybe that meeting has already started for you, quietly, in ways you hadn't quite put into words until today. Maybe it's still ahead of you, waiting in some ordinary afternoon you haven't lived yet. Either way, it's worth saying plainly once before we close, you were never actually disappearing. You were only ever becoming harder for the noisy parts of the world to see, so that the quieter, truer parts of your own life could finally come into view. Wherever you are as you listen to this, in a quiet kitchen, in a chair by the window, on a walk with earbuds in, I hope some part of what we talked about today follows you into the rest of your afternoon, gently like a thought you don't need to chase, just one you get to keep. If any part of this found you today, if some quiet corner of your life just felt a little more understood, I'd love for you to stay a while longer with us here on Elderly Light. We make these for exactly this reason, to sit with you in these questions honestly without rushing past the hard parts. If you'd like more of this kind of company, more reflections like the one we just shared, consider subscribing. Not because we need the number, but because it means the next time we sit down to write, we're writing for you again. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.